Calgary pastor Artur Pawlowski was sentenced to 60 days in jail in mid-September. He was found guilty of 1 count each of mischief and breaching a release order for his role in protests against COVID-19 public health measures. Pawlowski was sentenced to 60 days, but has 60 days time served, so he has 0 days left to serve, making him a free man. To chat about this in more detail is the son of the Calgary pastor, Nathaniel Pawlowski. Nathaniel, thank you so much for taking time out of your road trip to Toronto to join us today. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Now, as I mentioned in my opening, your father was given a suspended sentence and walked out of the Lethbridge courthouse a free man after his sentencing hearing. Was this the outcome that you were hoping for?
Well, yes, it is actually. We were expecting a much heftier sentence just because I believe this is a politicized trial. This is nothing based on law and order. Our lawyers are baffled that there was even a conviction. Nobody in the history of Canada has ever been found guilty of inciting mischief, which is essentially a speech crime. It's a thought crime, kind of like what hate speech would entail, where saying words that the government disagrees with can actually land you in prison, right? Because who decides what speech is legal? Well, that hands to the government, right? That would be handed down to the government to decide that. And what he did was he gave a 19-minute speech telling truckers to continue holding the line, to continue standing for the rights and freedoms, and of course referencing God and the Bible because he's a pastor. And that essentially warranted him being arrested and spending 50 days in solitary confinement, which counts as 78 days time served. So when he was handed down a 60-day sentence, he was given time served, so no extra prison. But I believe the political pressure that was received because of me going to European Parliament, because of different events and political pressure possibly helped in doing that because we were expecting, I mean, the prosecutor wanted a year in prison. So for him to get 60 days is unexpected.
Wow. So now you mentioned EU Parliament, and so this is where I want to go right now. Back in July, you were invited to address the EU Parliament in Brussels on behalf of your father. So tell us more about what you told them and what the response was, because I heard your speech ended in an eruption of applause.
Yeah, so I was invited actually to come speak about kind of the consequences of having the World Health Organization, the WEF, influencing sovereign nations' policies, right? So the WHO has a heavy hand to play in European Parliament and actually influencing policies. So they invited me to come speak about the consequences of that, one of which being the extremes, like the case of my father, where his church was raided, court orders, summons, he was arrested for keeping his church open, defying health orders. And that's kind of the extreme of what happens when you let this quote unquote health tyranny to happen, where pastors are arrested and jailed just because they are defying health orders. So I kind of spoke on that and what this means, what this entails for rights and freedoms, the Constitution, and for nations to remain sovereign and not have unelected bodies kind of influencing our policies and our laws. So I said that Trudeau is acting like a modern day Caligula, a tyrant, an emperor that's gone mad. And I'm saying that Canada needs help, actually. Canada needs help because I believe our judiciary is no longer independent, which essentially means that there's a top-down, authoritarian, totalitarian police state where the judges just do what their masters tell them to do because they are appointed by politicians. So why would they go against these politicians that appointed them?
And then what was the response that you received from these dignitaries from all over these European Union countries?
Well, because there was a bunch of members of European Parliament that were hosting this event, they were completely on board. They very, very sympathetic to the story, to the cause of what Canada is going through. And there was a standing ovation, huge reception. They were very, very receptive to the message. They loved the speech. I got to speak, and then right after me, my dad got to speak via video. And after our 8-minute presentation, the crowd erupted, and it was a huge, huge positive reception.
So going to more recent news now, the 1 Million March for Children took place in cities across Canada and even in the U.S. And this was an event held by a movement concerned about SOGI, which is sexual orientation and gender identity resources that schools can utilize. Did you attend or speak at any of these rallies?
Yeah, so I was actually in Ottawa I got to speak after the march. By my estimate, there was about 15 to 20,000 protesters from what I saw.
Wow.
And there was about 5 to 10,000 counter protesters. So there was roughly 30,000 people on Parliament Hill protesting, whether for or against. But it was a huge, huge movement, lots of people, amazing crowd, very peaceful. Jagmeet Singh was there. He was actually leading the protest, the counter protesters for the pro LGBT crowd. And Maxime Bernier was present, and Josh Alexander. I got to speak, and it was an incredible event. I thought it was absolutely beautiful.
It's interesting you mentioned the numbers in Ottawa, because I was following some of the mainstream media that was covering the Ottawa event, and it sounded like there was a huge representation of the LGBT community in Ottawa to counter protest, but you're saying that's not the case?
Yes, I saw that report as well, and that's absolutely false. I mean, there's video evidence. You can see how many of our side there was, and then how many counter protesters, pro LGBT protesters there were. And mainstream media is lying. They're lying to you. There was, I mean, it's hard to estimate when there's such a huge crowd of people, but there was about 5 to 10,000 counter protesters, and there was about 15 to 20,000 of us. So no, they were not outnumbering us whatsoever.
So with the protesters outnumbering the counter protesters, do you feel the event went well? Was there a lot of clashing going on between protesters and counter protesters?
Well, when they showed up at first to counter protest, there was some engaging back and forth, but police formed a barrier, and they were very. They actually did their job for once. They actually did prevent people from crossing and from conflict erupting. So they actually did create a barrier. So there was lots of yelling back and forth, but no physical assaults. No, I believe no charges were laid or anything like that. There was no clashing. But for a good hour, they were yelling back and forth for a long time. Yeah.
Nathaniel, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.